Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Trembling River by Andrée et Michaud. Translated by J.C. Sutcliffe. Narrated by Senn and Ray Galletti. Part 1. Night was falling over Rivière-aux-Trembles. In the maple-lined cemetery, my father lay sleeping, amid the mist created by the recent mild spell. Soon enough, February would once again blanket the ground in a layer of ice, encasing pebbles and bits of twigs severed by the frost. Behind the cemetery, a cloud had settled on Wolf Hill, so dense it seemed to be raining on the hillside, and only on the hillside, right above the black pines. The final birds of the dying day chirped a few solitary notes into the still air, while I stood motionless, wondering what to do with this somber beauty, caught between death and the looming darkness. I'd spent all day walking along the little muddy lanes that led to the village, or led away from it, depending on whether you wanted to go home or escape the sadness of abandoned places. After hours of wearing myself out, my hands and feet were frozen solid, but I was still second-guessing myself, unable to decide which direction to head in. I'd only returned to Rivière-aux-Trembles to pay final homage to my father, resting in the chapel where he would be shut up until the spring, and to place a few of his favorite Mary Jean roses on his coffin, where their speedy blanching would allow me to see death for what it really was, a new state of matter. Because that's all death is, a transformation of flesh and blood. This is what I kept repeating to myself, to avoid thinking of the end of all things, and all people. My father's body had been emptied of all thought, and could now soar up to a new kind of communion with the world, a state where the perception of light, heat, and cold would not be hindered by pain or knowledge. But what did I know of the pain of matter, or of the state of putrefaction soul? I imagined potential resurrections and reincarnations that precluded suffering, because I refused to believe that death was a definitive, immutable state. My father's passing had forced me to think about the fact that I would die too, and wonder what I was doing with myself, stalled in the middle of a life, just like any other life, at whose end there would be no possibility of appeal. I'd promised to leave Rivière-aux-Trembles the minute the funeral ceremony was over, and never set foot there again. But the feeling of no longer having much time left myself overwhelmed all my plans. I was surprised at my inability to summon up the strength to tear myself away from this village, where my childhood had ended so brutally. As I crouched near the tombstone of a stranger, who now faced the sunset for eternity, I asked my father to come to my rescue. I prayed to the mother I'd never known, who died too young, crushed in full sun. I implored the heavens to send me a sign, and at that very moment, a shout rang out, a cry of fear that could just as well have come from the depths of the earth as from the recesses of my memory. "Michael," I murmured, my voice husky from the rain and the cold. "Is that you, Michael?" But silence fell over the countryside once more, even denser than the stillness preceding the shout. So I ran. I took one of the 4 roads that cut through my village in the shape of a cross, and vanished into the twilight. After a few minutes I stopped, out of breath, resting my hands on my knees. As I lifted my head, I noticed a deer grazing near a thin strip of forest marching over the fields, lost in the fog descending over Wolf Hill. It was like one of those life-saving visions that lead people away from the abyss they were just about to hurl themselves into. I took a few steps forward into the field, deep in melting snow, and as the deer slipped into the forest, I let the tears I'd been holding back since the morning flow over the now sealed abyss. It was finally time for me to go back home. 1. The Stories. Marnie. He was 12, and I was 11, and just like knights in tales of chivalry, we had sworn never to leave each other, unaware that the forever of our promise might be brief. But while Michael St. Pierre had kept his promises, his memory had never left me. The forts we built, deep in the forests, and the intergalactic trips we used to plan, now only exist in those increasingly rare dreams, in which Michael, perched on the highest branch of an enormous tree, talks to me in childish words about the universe's endlessness. Michael Superman St. Pierre, son of Jeanne Dubé and Victor St. Pierre, went missing in the Rivière-aux-Trembles woods on August 7th, 1979. I don't know what happened in the woods. Nobody knows, except for Mike and his putative attacker. But sometimes I believe he's still alive, that some force, whose power I can't even conceive of, came to find him on his branch, to take him to Krypton's twin planet, or some distant star humans haven't yet discovered. At these times, I tell myself I'll receive a message from outer space one day, something shining out among the myriad stars I sometimes watch until I feel dizzy, a sign telling me that Michael St. Pierre is getting ready to come back to Earth. The truth is that Michael probably died deep in the woods, his disintegrating body swept along by the river into the mouths of coyotes and wolves, unless some predator with an all-too-human face threw himself on Michael, for reasons that can only be explained by insanity. But in the absence of a body, I continue to hope that my friend Mike is still wandering around the mossy floor of some distant forest, trapped by thunder-induced amnesia. And if this is the case, perhaps his footsteps, propelled by some fuzzy childhood memory, will end up leading him here, to Rivière-aux-Trembles, this place I decided to move back to after 29 years away from it, all because of a shout of unknown origin. Michael and I had heard this same cry on 2 occasions that summer, the summer of 1979, the summer he disappeared. The first one happened a little before nightfall, when a lack of wind allows sound to travel through the humid air. We were messing around and throwing stones into Catfish Lake. Whoever misses the rock on the point is a loser, when a scream ripped through the dawning darkness, making even the birch bark shiver. One last rock sank into the still water, and Michael froze on the spot, his arm in the air, as I dropped the flat pebble I'd unearthed from under a pile of driftwood. Our eyes met, and without having to discuss it, we raced to the lake path and ran as fast as our legs could carry us towards the village. Before we could reach Morin Sisters Road, where we'd hidden our chrome bicycles, blue with red handlebars for Michael, Superman's colors, and black for me, because it was the only one left in the store the day my father had bought it for me, I stumbled on a root lying across the path and wiped out in slow motion. My Pippi Longstocking braids, tied with lemon yellow elastics, flew in front of my eyes, preceded by my Expos cap, while my hands scrabbled at the air, and then the section of sky where my cap was spinning disappeared. With my nose in muddy earth, rotting leaves, and pine needles, I'd felt sure a hand was gripping my left leg and pulling me backwards, towards the lake and its depths. This was a first warning, I realized afterwards, the first sign of the fate that would come crashing down on Michael and me, putting an end to all our games. I was imagining the cracked black nails, like the talons of the witches in Phantom Swamp, a mythical place invented to keep children away from the peat bogs east of Wolf Hill, sinking into my ankle when Michael's hands grabbed me under my arms to help me stand up. "Hurry up, Marnie, quick, it's going to catch us, it's coming, I can feel it." But it had already arrived, it was already there, this thing that would make even the sun in Rivière-aux-Trembles go crazy. The next day, we found out that Martin Bouchard, the oldest son of the mayor, Jas Bouchard, had drowned around 8 the previous evening, as he was pulling out the fishing lines he'd cast at the mouth of Blueberry River, 5 kilometers by road from Catfish Lake, less than 2 kilometers as the crow flies, and within shouting distance when the air is humid. "We heard the cry of death, Marn," Michael murmured, spitting his gum onto the sidewalk, and we stood frozen to the spot, staring at the forest where death had screamed. The second time this shout rang out in the area would also be the last, at least that summer. It was August 7th, a torrid August 7th, and the sun occasionally flickered through the increasingly dense thunderclouds. We were sprawled on the porch, killing time and counting the flies stuck to the front of Michael's house. Michael was also supposed to be watching his little sister, Émilie, Émilulu, Émilili, while his mother went over to Mrs. Tremblay's to teach her how to make a strawberry cobbler using a recipe in which the strawberries could be switched out for raspberries, blueberries, blackberries, plums, apples, or red currants, essentially for any small, medium, or large fruit that grew near us. The afternoon stretched out endlessly in a humid heat that seemed to affect even Emmy Lily's ragdolls, who were lolling with their legs akimbo on the porch floorboards. Our clothes stuck to our skin. Emmy's fine blonde hair formed damp little commas on her forehead, and the massive crickets gathered in the yellow hay had silenced all the birds. We resented Denise Tremblay, who'd got married in June in a wedding dress like something out of a magazine and didn't even know how to boil an egg. And we were annoyed with Michael's mother, who'd got it into her head to transform this newlywed into a cordon bleu chef. When we saw her old Datsun appear in the laneway, we ran to find our swimsuits. Michael called out that we were going swimming without listening to her admonishments or even bothering to say hello. Behind us, Emmy Lily started crying. "I want to come with you, Mike. Take Mimi. Take Lily." These were just the innocent cries of a child, but they would be forever engraved in the memory I would retain of that day. Years later, these same cries would yank me from sleep. Little Emmy Lou's sobs as she begged her brother not to abandon her, not to leave her alone during the storm, to take her with them into the woods some people never returned from. Perhaps she'd guessed from the grayness of the sky that she would never again see Michael, her brother, her God. Michael patted her on the head and handed her a toffee lollipop that had been lurking at the bottom of one of his pockets. "Mike won't be long, Lily," he said, and we straddled our flying bicycles to head down the 4th line, then along a path to where the river formed a little basin where we could dive without hurting ourselves, avoid the eyes of the forest monsters, and float on our backs as we gazed through the leaves at the changing shapes of the clouds. This was our secret place, our oasis, far from the dull, strict adult world. Michael had named it the Magic Swimming Hole, and claimed this was where a fortress would rise up out of the water, the fortress in which he would live in solitude once he turned 18. While we were waiting for the glittering proof of Superman's distant origins to emerge from the river, we'd built ourselves a shelter out of branches under the pines, facing the swimming hole. That's where we were when the storm broke out, sorting the stones we'd fished up from the bottom of the water by size and color. The first drops hit the shelter roof as Michael was arranging white pebbles beside the circle of black rocks whose powers would make us untouchable. "It's going to thunder, Marn," he said, as he glanced through the opening that served as the shelter's doorway, and then he ran out to grab our swimsuits from where they were drying side by side on a flat rock. He could only have been gone a few seconds, but when he didn't come back, I went over to the doorway and looked out. Mike was standing near the rock, his back to the shelter, swinging from right to left as he lifted one leg and then the other, like the old rusty metal robot he finally got rid of at the beginning of the summer. Our bathing suits dangled from the ends of his outstretched arms, and his head flopped down over his chest, as if he no longer had the strength to hold it up straight. Looking as though his neck was broken, he seemed to be staring down at his left running shoe, whose lace had come untied. At first, I thought it was a joke, that Michael was trying to wind me up, but something didn't sit quite right. He looked like one of the zombies in Night of the Living Dead, which we'd secretly watched a few weeks earlier. He looked like Emmy Lou's dolls, with their slack limbs and drooping necks. "What are you doing, Mike? This isn't funny." But he didn't react. He carried on swaying from left to right, and then started taking cautious steps backwards, his arms still raised, until a light flashed across the sky above the water. Then he leapt back, flapping his arms like the robot in Lost in Space that cries, "Danger! Danger!" Except Mike wasn't shouting, but, like the robot, he was afraid of a shadow I couldn't see heading towards him, hidden from me by the trees, his body, and the rain. I looked around for the shadow of this zombie that wanted to devour Michael, but I could only make out the movement of the branches in the wind, behind which multitudes of powerful, threatening arms might well be moving. Just as I thought I could make out the hairy arm, all scratched and slashed, about to rise out of the trees, I heard, over the grumbling of the thunder, the piercing cry of the drowned young man of Blueberry River, the scream that had announced Martin Bouchard's death. A second flash of lightning immediately ripped through the clouds, and Michael froze on the spot, letting our bathing suits fall to his feet in such a slow gesture I thought the damp fabric was going to remain suspended from his open hands and never touch the ground. My throat was as dry as if I'd raced non-stop from the village to the Mailloux pond. I repeated that I didn't find his play acting the slightest bit amusing. "Stop messing around, Mike. You're not funny at all." When the wind started whirling around our swimming hole, I tried to tell him to come back to the shelter, wanting to say, "Quick, Mike, it's coming. It's here. There's werewolves and witches." But I had no voice, paralyzed by Mike's immobility, his petrified body standing in the rain. "You're scaring me, Mike," I managed to murmur, or maybe sob. I don't even know anymore, but my fear wasn't strong enough to rattle his torpor. After a few endless seconds, he finally turned to look at me, whiter than the freshly laundered sheets tousled-haired women hang out in the Rivière aux Trembles backyards on summer mornings. I thought he was going to faint, but he said a few words to me, or maybe to the invisible specters standing in front of his vacant, staring eyes. In the howling of the wind that made the trees bend and bow, I didn't hear what he said. I only saw his mouth open mechanically, his lips purse around strange sounds. "Foggy day, ma'am. Foggy day. How can you manage?" And then, as if he had suddenly come out of a trance, he flashed me a desolate smile, discreetly raised his hand in a gesture of goodbye, and ran off between the trees, pushed by the arms that were multiplying in the storm. I should have run to catch up with him, followed the dark corridor he was disappearing into, but my legs were as soft as cotton wool, while my feet felt as though I was wearing concrete shoes. I came out of the shelter on all fours, thinking only of Mike's absurd words, "Foggy day, ma'am, foggy day," and then of his unlaced running shoe, all of it mixed up together, all chaotic, imagining how his beat-up shoe that was slapping against his bare heel would get stuck between two roots and make him stumble. When I succeeded in getting myself upright, my mind as confused as if I'd just woken from a nightmare. The red splash of Mike's t-shirt had already disappeared in the jumble of the forest. Another streak lit up the sky, which was darkening as the wind catapulted clouds across it, and I was still alone, futilely calling out for Michael St. Pierre. I waited for him in the shelter until the storm was spent, walled in by the echo of the scream that had broken the sky with a mauve flash. Then I pedaled my chrome bike home with trembling knees, struggling with each revolution of the pedals against the unknown force trying to drag me backwards. 1 hour later, 30-odd men, led by a child racked by spasms, headed down the path to the magic swimming hole, where they branched out in different directions, like the arms of a star, at the center of which was the spot where Michael had dropped our wet bathing suits. Inside the shelter, the rock circles had been broken.
Bill, I washed up in Rivière aux Trembles like a stone tossed around by the current. I could have ended up in Chicago, Sept-Îles, Timbuktu, or Maniwaki, but this is where my fall from grace led me. It was exactly what I needed. Some godforsaken hole where Lucienne couldn't come and harass me with her accusations. A place where I could stew in my misery, bending Billie's ear with the stories this bitch of a life hadn't allowed me to finish. During Billie's lifetime, I'd told her so many stories I sometimes felt as though reality didn't exist anymore, that it was nothing more than a pale imitation of the movie spooling in the somewhat twisted minds of guys like me. We would be sitting nice and warm in the sunshine on the veranda. I would pick up a book at random, Moby Dick, The Odyssey, Cinderella, or Hop on My Thumb, and for my daughter I would reinvent Captain Ahab's journey, Cinderella's nocturnal jaunts, or Ulysses' adventures with the Cyclops. For her, I mingled together history and its thousands of stories. I was always messing around with these classics by having Pinocchio stand at the prow of the Pequod, or by marrying Hop on My Thumb off to the princess who slept with the pea under her mattress. Because basically, Billie liked it, because it made her laugh and dream, and because the dreams of small girls are some of the most beautiful things in the world. Nobody can take that away from me. Her favorite stories were, however, the same as mine. Ronnie the Flying Toad, The Newt's Dynasty, Alice and the Seven Cats, those short stories that had made my fortune and carried me to places as far away as Iceland. Ronnie had been translated into 17 languages and adapted into a cartoon during the 90s. It had done so well that when I met L.A., Lucienne, I was able to buy us a fancy house in a neighborhood where proper, well-educated people lived. The kind of people who didn't spit on the sidewalk and who got drunk on expensive wine. At the age of 40, I could have lived off my royalties, but I applied myself to writing more stories about newts and polyglot toads, at the same time trying to inculcate in jaded students a few theories that they would try to apply to fiction before they realized that nobody was interested in it. My life revolved around these three elements: my students, oblivious to everything that eluded them, my notebooks, and Billie Newt, the only princess in my kingdom, who jumped onto my lap at every opportunity so I could invent some new tale of a toad, alligator, or snowy owl, right up until she discovered Harry Potter, the young Indiana Jones, Pippi Longstocking, and a whole host of heroines and heroes, none of whom looked like a toad who just stepped out of an enchanted swamp. From that day onwards, my Batrachians, Homer, and the Brothers Grimm faced some stiff competition. I could have been jealous or annoyed with Billie for preferring the adventures of an apprentice sorcerer, or a little girl who could pick up a horse while she sang in Swedish, over the fairy universe of my talking bestiary, but how could you be irritated with a princess who turns you into a Prince Charming every day? "Love you, Papa Newt," she used to call out as she jumped out of my bed, and my nightmares and anxieties ebbed away under the covers. Billie's sudden attraction for these stories in which childhood comes up against human stupidity showed me she was growing up. I preferred to ignore this fact, as long as she didn't start getting cigarette burns on her princess dresses, but she was also showing me it was time to reskill. But the idea of abandoning my toads for cowboys who get to meet Sigmund Freud and Gertrude Stein, or for futuristic metal creatures who communicate by tapping their heads together, inspired me about as much as the idea of becoming a gravedigger in Azerbaijan. My desire to elicit Billie's admiration being stronger than my literary inclinations, my plan for her next birthday was to concoct an adventure starring the young Indy and Billie Longstocking, because, I confess, I had a soft spot for Indy, as well as for Pippi, who'd traveled through the decades without getting too scratched and dented, kind of like a punk Joan of Arc. However, the birthday in question never arrived. I waited for her, God knows I waited for her, convinced that Billie would never willingly miss out on her cherry cake or her 9 red candles, sure that it was simply impossible for her not to come racing down the stairs with her party hat yanked down over her tangled hair. I waited in vain, and I never wrote my Billie and the Lost Ark, which was probably all for the best, since I would no doubt have failed in my attempt to measure up to George Lucas and Astrid Lindgren in one fell swoop. The last story she'd asked me to read to her was from the Harry Potter series. I remember it because I left the book lying around, and it fell off the side table at the exact moment Lucienne burst into the house shouting that Billie had never arrived at her ballet class, that she'd left school at 3:30 as usual but had never shown up at the dance teacher's studio. She was screaming and gesticulating hysterically, and I had to grab her arms before she strangled herself with the scarf she was trying to rip off her neck. Once I worked out what Lucienne was trying to tell me, I raced to Billie's room just in case she was hiding out there to escape the chore of ballet lessons. After searching the whole second floor, I ran down the stairs 4 at a time and noticed Lucienne's scarf lying in melted snow on the floor, next to the much-trampled novel. I pushed the scarf aside and grabbed the book, frantically wiping the cover where one of Lucienne's heels had crushed Harry Potter's face and glasses. For a moment, I had the impression that the young Harry, behind his broken spectacles, wanted to cast an evil spell on me, turning me into a Petrificus Totalis victim. And I wasn't completely wrong, because I stood there paralyzed while Lucienne bawled behind me, telling me to get my ass in gear and find her daughter. It was Lucienne who'd insisted on signing Billie up for ballet lessons, despite Billie's protests. She ought to have known not to force a plumpish child to face a peloton of little matchstick girls ready to open fire on anyone who didn't fit the mold. That's how armies work. That's how we get the first victims of wars. But L.A. didn't want to hear about it. L.A. had always been slim. L.A. was as ignorant as all slim women are when it came to self-image, and had no idea whatsoever of the burden of a round body. After 2 months of dance, Billie was basically existing on carrots and vegetable juice. So the day the little Dumas boy was run over by a car, I brought my fist down on the table and said, "That's enough, we're done. We're not going to force a child who might get run over any moment by a 10-ton truck to dress up in a ridiculous itchy tutu just so she might get cast as a loser mouse in some miserable little production of the Nutcracker." L.A. slammed the door in my face, and Billie had carried on with her lessons and her diet until the day she cracked in front of a chocolate eclair, with me egging her on furiously by stuffing 3 of them down my own gullet. At a mere 8 years old, Billie was too fragile, too sweet, too cheerful to be corseted by images out of the glossy magazines that had spent 3 or 4 decades perpetuating the vicious lie that the ideal woman looks like a barely pubescent girl in the last stages of anorexia. The battle of the carrots versus the eclairs, which ended with chocolate's calorific power knocking out vitamin C's virtues, took place a few days before Billie disappeared. L.A. was having a few friends over for brunch, and Billie and I took advantage of the time to slink off for a stroll. We couldn't decide between the botanical gardens and the movies, but then Billie decreed it was too cold to go hunting for alien tracks in the botanical garden's snowy paths, as we had planned. This alien spotting business went way back with us. Billie, who must have been 4, was perched on top of one of the kitchen bar stools, looking out the window, when she noticed the little marks on the white ground made by the snow that had fallen from the trees around the house. These prints, which she'd never noticed before, fascinated her, and I told her they were Martian tracks, which was the modern version of the goblin footprints of my own childhood. Some parents try to explain everything very rationally to their children, from the moment they cut their first tooth, teaching them the law of relativity at the age of 4, banning the Cartoon Network. They even refuse to let them wander in magical dream worlds filled with ethereal creatures, monsters or fairies, ogres or sprites, where they might learn that reality is not always what it seems, and that there are universes where the trees are red, and where flowers the size of sperm whales roam the oceans. L.A., unfortunately, was among that faction of parents who only believe in educational toys, fluffy rabbits who count to 100, alarm clocks that wake you with opera music, or chunks of earwax that recite Aesop's fables. Seeing that she was about to explain to Billie where the marks in the snow really came from, I shot her one of my most killer looks, preferring to wound L.A.'s pride rather than prevent Billie's imagination from flying free and creating a world that could belong to her and her alone, and which she would remember, years later, as one of the most beautiful parts of the earth. Once tracking down aliens was off the table, Billie started hopping and prancing around me and asking if we could go back and see Ice Age, even though we just watched it a week earlier. I've never understood why children feel the need to be told the same stories over and over. When I interrogated Billie on the subject, she just gaped at me open-mouthed and then gave me the most logical answer. "Well, because I like those stories, Papa Newt." So then I would open the picture book or the novel she was showing me and think to myself that it must make her feel safe to know in advance that the big bad wolf was going to be neutralized, that Indy's genius would let him conquer the enemy, come what may, and that no real danger could be lurking under her bed as long as good triumphed over evil. I suppose this ritual of repetition gave the illusion of a kind of stability, which, she could already tell, did not really exist. The reason children beg for the story of the 3 little pigs 4 nights in a row is that they want to live for as long as possible in an illusion protecting them from the vastness of the world and the incoherence of time. At least, that's my guess. As you get older, you forget so many of the basic things. You sometimes wonder what the point of being young was, if you're too foolish to remember where happiness comes from. True happiness. The sort that overflows because of a 3-scoop ice cream cone with a cherry on top. With Billie, I solved the problem of repetition by combining stories with happy endings, or by changing the endings of the ones that made no sense to a child who was dropping off to sleep while clutching a teddy bear to her chest. In this way, The stories I told her were always the same and never the same, which kept me from annoying the slightly dopey adult I'd become.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?